I would like to show you now the difference between a two-dimensional and a three-dimensional wood texture. Before we do this, let's slice this viewport and then here press N, go to view lens, and this one I set to a 55 so I don't have such a wide angle lens. Okay, so let's do the rendering. Shift Z or go to the viewport shading and select rendered. And this is what we have. It doesn't look too bad. Obviously there are some flaws because you can see there are these edges which we can actually soften a little bit by using the blend command. You see now it blends actually these edges nicer together. That's actually pretty good. As a quick preview, that's fine. But it's not really very correct because obviously we know wood doesn't grow this way, so this wood structure, while visually looks maybe pleasing, it's simply physically not correct. And our material is basically a basic diffuse. Then we have this image node where we can load the wood texture, and then this two-dimensional image has to be projected over this our cube. So we use the box mapping, and then the texture coordinate system helps us to kind of like tell the software how we want the texture to be glued over the individual faces. Okay, so let's here select the object, Shift S, cursor to select it, and then Shift A or add, let's make a cube. Okay, and this cube, edit mode or object mode, doesn't matter which one you use, we make a little bit smaller and maybe we move it to there. Okay, so what we will do now is actually we will select this cube where we have the texture applied to, go to the modifier, add modifier, Boolean, difference, and then we say select this cube to cut this piece out. And then this cube you see actually in the rendering is in my way. So two ways how to fix this. This is, for example, a Boolean cube. So for example, we can call this one cube Boolean, or sometimes what I do very often, I mark all objects that do Boolean functions with Boolean, and then I use the name, because then later it's very easy to filter all the Boolean objects out. And in my 3D view here, I would like only to see the wireframe. So I could go to display, maximum draw type, instead of textured, say wired. So now you can see here how I can move this around in real time and see like how this cube actually cuts the other cube. But in render time, I still see that cube. So if we go down here to cycle settings, there's also ray visibility, and we can actually turn all the stuff simply off. Okay. To explain this again, display, this only are the view settings for the 3D real-time view, not a render time. And then cycles, because we use the rendered mode and we use cycles as the engine, these are the visibilities for the object during render time. And we want simply to be it invisible. So we turn everything off. Okay, so now we see this. And if we would look actually from here, then yeah, this actually looks okay. No, not too bad. The grain matches a little bit, but here we can see, yeah, that doesn't match. It doesn't work. So the problem there glaringly is evident. And that is basically the limitation of a two-dimensional material when we use just a texture and then we try to glue the texture onto the different faces, because wood has a three-dimensional structure. So we can't simulate that necessarily so easily with just two-dimensional textures. One could say, well, we could find, for example, an image of n-grain and images from other sides of the wood material and then appropriately texture each of those faces. Well, it's just way too much work, and the chances you find even fitting textures are rather very slim. So let me introduce you now to what a three-dimensional wood texture would be. So let's turn this one off. Let's select the cube. And let's say you do not want to lose the wood material. If we would basically click X, you see the material is removed. And there's a 0 in front. And that means this wood material has no user. And if we save and quit Blender, Blender has an automatic clean function. It dumps everything that's not being in use. To make sure that we do not lose that material, we can click this F, and F here stands for a fake user. So with this on and off, you see now there's a 2. That means 2 users are using it. 2 users, the cube that currently uses it, and the fake user. Now if I click on this X, I still just removed the material, but if I take a look at the material list, there you see now there's an F and not a 0 in front. Okay, perfect. So that's what you want. Now we can create a new material, and for example we call this one wood 3D. Okay. Maybe let's adjust our views here a little bit. There. Good. Okay, let's zoom in. And this one maybe we can move to there. So we have the material output. That's basically what will be used for the object. And then we have this diffuse material. Diffuse material is basically a mathematical formula to describe a surface that is not glossy, just matte. So we can adjust the color, we can adjust the roughness. The roughness adjusts a little bit how matte or how the matte finish will look. And then we have the normal, which later we will use for the faking a three-dimensional structure. So if you think about a tree is basically built out of rings. And the way to generate three-dimensional wood is trying to recreate nothing else than a ring structure. Okay, so inside the node editor, you can press Shift A and then go to Texture and select Wave. And then you have this node. We can, with a left mouse button, drag these two yellow elements together. So basically the color output of the wave texture will now override the white color of the diffuse material. If we jump into rendered mode, you will see something like this. Okay, so here are a few settings. Currently you see everything is made out of bands, but I mentioned a tree material because the way how a tree works and how we cut lumber out of a tree trunk is built out of rings. So the bands we switch to rings, and then the sinus we can switch to saw because that is closer to how the tree actually looks. Okay. For the moment, the three-dimensional effect of the Boolean is a little bit irritating, so I can turn the render effect off and the visibility here, there. Okay, well, let's rotate around a little bit and let's take a look at what we have. And you see there everywhere some kind of like, looks like half rounds. For example, we can play with the scale to make it bigger or smaller. There's also a distortion. You see the distortion adds a certain amount of noise to it, so it doesn't look so mathematically perfect. Okay, so maybe let's set this to 5. And before we continue, one check. I'm using actually a metric system, and my cube currently is a meter by meter by meter. So that's somewhat important to keep in mind. Okay, next step. What I would like to do now is I need to be able to position this texture. Where, for example, does it start? And if we take a look at the top, you see the object center for this cube is at the center, and also from the side, the center point is at the center. So where this object center point is, the textures in terms of rings will grow outways. Currently we don't really see this, but we will see this just in a second. So what we have to do now, we can go to add or shift A, add the texture coordinates. And then we can select the object. And then now you can see actually how the three-dimensional texture adjusted, because now it actually grows from the object center point. Okay, good. Now I would like to move this around a little bit. So how can I do this? I need some sort of a tool to move the texture, to stretch it along X and Y, to move it along X, Y, and Z, up and down, left and right, etc. So with the texture coordinate module, I basically told the texture the coordinate system it should use. In our case, grow the texture from the object center point, because we use object. If we just use generated, it will look like this. It uses something different. If we use camera, it will actually from the center of the camera grow out. So we can, for example, move around, and you see how the texture always follows it. But now we want to use object. Okay, perfect. So the next module I will introduce you to, and which we will work a lot with, is called the mapping node. So Shift A, then vector and mapping. You see, when you create a new node and you have a long noodle and you move this node onto that noodle, the noodle turns orange. That basically means if I left mouse button click, it then inserts the node in between these two other nodes, and then it connects everything correctly. Before I continue, let me explain you what vector basically means. Think about vector as something else, as a directional information. Because from the object center point, the vector is basically the texture grows to the outside. So that's the reason why the blue has to connect it to the blue vector. Then the object information, now with the mapping mode, we can adjust. So, for example, let's see, Y is this axis. So when I play with Y here and move this a little bit around, you see I'm adjusting the value for Y. And then this adjusted value, so that information is then given out via the vector into the wave texture vector input. So now the wave texture knows generate this texture, but minus 13 centimeters to the left. I hope this makes sense. Okay, so for example, we can set this to 1 if we want, and for example, maybe set this back to 0. So now this is very, very big. Then we have here something called scale. Now, if we, for example, type in 2 or maybe 10, you see actually we can scale the texture. The reason why I set this one to 1 was basically that this is a number 1, and now it's a little bit easier to work with those. If later I would like to have double the amount of rings, I can switch this to 2, and you see now this is double the amount, or half the amount. I just go a quarter. So think about those as scale factors. Because you have a scale here and you have a scale there, I find it most times easier to set maybe the scale to 1 and then exclusively work with the scale numbers inside the mapping node. And then if I want to double it or so, I can easily use then the scale value inside the procedural texture. I also said procedural texture. So what does it mean? An image is two-dimensional, so it's an image pixel-oriented texture. But a procedural texture is actually math code that just generates the look for me, because I can zoom in as much as I want and it will always be nice and sharp and crisp. And you know, with images, when you zoom too much, at one point you see the pixels popping up. So the advantage of those procedural textures, like the wave texture, is they are resolution independent. So what else can we do? For example, this is X. We can, for example, move this one, let's say, to there. And for example, Z, we can move this one up and down. There you can see how, for example, we're moving the center point. And let's say as an end grain, and this would look okay in case we would cut right through a tree trunk, but from here that doesn't look necessarily very correct yet, believable. And now all we have to do is, in our case, with Z and Y, I can adjust the scale of how many rings I would like. So Z and Y, for example, 5. You see I have less rings, not really many rings, or for example, a lot more rings. So you see Z and Y based on how my object is oriented, and X, however, describes the length now of the cube. And the X I have to scale differently. So if I, for example, increase the number, you see I am compressing the texture. That's not really what I want. I actually want to stretch it. So in my case, I have to adjust the scale to a different value. And there you see now this starts to look more like the cathedrals you used to when, for example, you would cut something out of the tree trunk. If maybe, let's say we set this to 0, or we move this one even further up, there you can see that even better. Okay, let's set this back to 0. Good. Okay, great. So little demonstration. We go back to the modifiers, and then I turn the eye visibility on. By the way, the camera again, that's actually for turning the effect of this modifier on off during rendering, and this is then the effect on off during my preview rendering or inside the 3D view. Let's turn this on, and you see now when we rotate our view, the cut is perfect. And that is, again, this is a mathematically calculated texture. It's procedural, and it's not only two-dimensional, but as you can see, it has a volume, which is why this is the better way how to texture actually wood. Okay. So before we continue, I would like to adjust this cube a little bit, because currently it's just too much a cube. I rather would like to turn this into a plank. Okay, so we should actually adjust this. So what I will do is the following. With the shift mouse button pressed and then left mouse button click, I can select all these points. And during class, I saw that people were trying to move these points, and then later, instead of having a cube, they ended up with other interesting looking geometrical shapes. And that's pretty common when you're a beginner. So there's a little bit of modeling discipline you have to learn. So there are two ways now how to stretch this one. Either I select via left mouse button and shift all these 4 points, and then I only click on the red arrow key, in my case, and then I can stretch or move them. So this way I make the object bigger. Don't click on the white ring, because this might, for example, happen. And you also don't want to move them this way. So maybe that it looks correct, because we're actually moving the stuff three-dimensional, and there you see that this is actually junk. So let's quickly undo all this. So again, when you're in 3D view, just make use of the move manipulation. Or you can also press G and X, because we know we have to move it along the X-axis, move it as desired, and then click. Perfect. Now you see we have a bigger plank. That's much better. Because then this way we have a bigger wood material we could preview, and this is still actually not very big, and maybe there. So those were one or two ways. There's another way we could do in object mode. This only works, not in edit mode. You see in edit mode you have different settings for transformation, and in object mode then we also see the dimension. Now in dimension we can see that X currently is 2.6 meters. Let's say we make this 4 meters. And one thing is very important. You see there's a scale factor, because in object mode we adjusted the dimension, and then that adjusts the scale. And this scale factor will influence the dimensions and values we have in mapping. So whenever you do this, this is also very good practice in general. You can go to object, and then you have to select apply scale. This is really important, because I'm going to S and X, scale this one along X, and you see actually the texture simply shrinks with it. But that's not really what I want. I don't want the texture to shrink. I want the texture to be the same, but only show me now a smaller block of this geometry of this texture. So if I now go object, apply and scale, I will actually select the shortcut so you can see the image better. Scale. There you see now the texture adjusted. 4 meters, S and Control A, and then select scale. There, perfect. Okay. The next thing I would like to show you is how we can position the object center point more perfectly. So here I will select everything AA, and then simply maybe I will move this a little bit to there, so I have this box cutting it again. But now my object center point is not really at a face. So in edit mode I can, for example, select those 4 points. So it selects the 3D cursor, it puts the 3D widget at the center. I can also simply select a diagonal, because currently this is actually a symmetrical object. You see it doesn't change anything. And then Shift S and cursor to select it. Now in edit mode I selected a position and then snapped the cursor to it. And then in object mode I would like to move the object center point to where my cursor is. So you have to go to object mode, and then in tools, set origin to 3D cursor, or Shift Control Alt C. So Shift Control Alt C, and then select origin to 3D cursor. And now you see the origin switch to there. Because my geometry for the texture actually starts from here going outwards. So that's always the easiest way to do it, because then, for example, this we might even be able to skip. So let's do a rendering, and there you see now, if we set this to 10 as well, how actually it grows from this point. Maybe 6. I will make those a little bit bigger for the next element I would like to show you. Okay, good. So wood texture, black and white, it doesn't look necessarily very interesting. So I will show you now step by step all the next elements, how we could colorize actually this wood texture. So I will, for example, collapse those two parts. You see this way with the triangle, you can make them smaller, and then just move them away out of my view. This one we can collapse, and this one we can collapse. They don't really change much as well. Okay, and this one we will move for the moment to here. Now the wave texture, because it's procedural, and procedural textures most times in general work with black and white. So they give you a black and white output, which is what we see. And that's not what I want. However, we can colorize what's black and we can colorize what's white. So we can go to add and then color and insert a mix RGB node. Can plug it onto the noodle, then it connects, and this one we want to reconnect to there. Let's take this out for a second. Here we have two color fields, we have a mix factor, and we have a blending type. We can keep for the moment this set to mix. And let's make this one red, and let's make this one blue. Okay, so you see the color is actually a mix of blue and red, 50%. And with the slider set to 0, it uses 100% color 1. With this set to 50% or 0.5, it uses 50-50. And with this set to 1, it uses 100% of color 2. So this is basically what the factor is doing. So it's blending actually, or mixing between these two colors based on the number I have here. Now the wave texture, because it generates a black and white texture, we can use the color values actually as a way to blend. So the factor, for example, I can plug in here, and there you see now everything being recolorized. I can also use the color in this case here, it doesn't really matter much. Okay, perfect. So you see now there is no value to switch, because what's black is one color, what's white is the other color. And because again everything is procedural, if I adjust, for example, the scale here, I will adjust the wave texture, which will change the texture that goes into the mix node, which then adjusts the output that goes into the diffuse, that goes into the material, and will be rendered on our object. Okay. The colors here right now we can adjust to something that maybe looks a little bit more wood-like, maybe something like this. Okay, so the trick there is really trying to find values that look actually pretty good. And we also want to make sure that our environment is not too dark, because then you can see that actually the colors here and what we have inside our environment there, it doesn't match very well. So for such things, make sure you have a nice bright environment. Or for the beginning phase, we can also work with just a white environment. So you see the colors are actually pretty close and the same. So we can work a little bit more, let's say a neutral light environment, or it's evenly illuminated, so the colors we select will be closer to what we see during render time. And then later when we do a rendering, obviously we need to adjust the lighting so everything looks the way how we want. Okay. But it might be a little bit tricky to figure out the correct color values. And maybe you have, for example, a texture you would like to sample colors from. So let me show you now how we can make use of the UV image editor. So I will slice this viewport and then there load in the UV image editor. And I can click on open and then, for example, go to wherever I have my files. So I go to industrial design, design resources, textures, and there's, for example, this wood material. I click cancel because we also have this already loaded since we have this other wood 2D material inside this blend file, which makes use of this wood texture. So whenever you have a texture used in a material, it will also show up inside the UV image editor. You can click on it, and then with the mouse wheel we can zoom in and zoom out, and the middle mouse button we can pan around. So, and then there we have, for example, a lot of color pixels we can select. A little trick, if you want to get a value, try to zoom in a lot so you have nice big blocks you can actually sample from. And then click on the color field. There is an eyedropper, and then we can sample from there. Eyedropper, sample from there. And you see then this way we can adjust our color selections. Okay. And if we are done and we don't need to see this anymore, click on the corner icon for the slicing or joining a window, and then left mouse button click drag to the right side so we join it back together. Perfect. So what we can do now in the next step is, for example, try to adjust the look of our wood texture a little bit. We have adjusted the color a little bit, and the scale I keep on purpose a little bit bigger, but you see that the wave look way too uniform. So at this point, for example, we can introduce maybe a little bit of, let's say, noise, and just maybe distort a little bit. Not too crazy, so be careful because this is just way too much, but a certain amount definitely will be good. And you see, this distortion does not only affect the cathedrals we see there, but it also affects actually the way how the rings are, which is why the cathedrals are adjusted. And when we zoom in a little bit, you can even see that there's a slight variation in the shading, how the saw profile, for example, blends from dark to white. So from this color to this color. That's pretty nice actually. Okay, and let me go back. There's also here something called detail. We can make it very low detail, or we can increase the detail. So there's even more stuff happening. Detailed scale, we can play with this as well. But most times I just leave it as 1 for this. Okay. Perfect. So, step 2, or next step. Don't even know which step we are right now. We created basically the rings. We adjusted the colors and added a little bit of noise. But what's missing are, for example, the pores. The end grain has all these pores, and then at the sides, we sometimes, based on how we cut the piece of wood, we cut through these pores. So you will see them actually at the sides as well as longer lines. And actually at the end grain, we might see the pores simply as dots. So let me show you now the next texture which we can use in the process to create these pores. So I will try to adjust my interface a little bit, scale this around, there and there. I'll keep this to there, there, there. Perfect. And for the moment, I will close this one and this one. Good. So we can go to add and then texture, and then we select the Voronoi. I have a really hard time saying this correctly, but we will use the V texture. And this texture basically, if we plug it right into the diffuse, creates nothing else than a cell structure. We have multiple options. For example, we can make a cell structure like this. If we, for example, colorize this one basically in metallic colors, then this could look like the anodized texture or structure on a light mast on the street. We will work with the intensity, and also here we have, for example, a scale. Okay, let's set this to 1, so it's big, and we have to make, I think, a copy of the mapping mode. So you see we can drag this one out, but then we work with exactly the same values of the mapping node, which we will use for the wave texture, and that's not necessarily what I want. I want to be able to add some extra details to the Voronoi texture. So select the mapping node, Shift D, we can make a copy, and then we can plug this one in. So I will also use object. Let's for the moment set this all to 1, and then we can drag this one to there. And for example, now we can figure out what's the correct size. So 20, 60, yeah, 60 maybe will work. So it looks like a Dalmatiner pushed into a box. So this is the end grain. So here we need to have a nice and detailed pattern. So currently this is still too big. I just make the texture a little bit bigger so it's easier for you to see. But I mentioned the pores, obviously, they grow through the tree, so upwards. And X, that's currently representing the height of the tree. So at this view being the end grain, the pores might look good, but from here this is not correct. So also along X we have to adjust this. So maybe let's see what we can use. 10, 5, maybe let's keep it at this for the moment. Okay, good. Now also with the Voronoi texture we can, for example, Shift A, color, and mix RGB. Mix, for example, something like this based on the factor, for example, the Voronoi texture generates. So you see pretty much the same as with the wave texture. Okay. So let's say we would like to match the colors. We can click on this one, click on the eyedropper and select this one. But we can also left mouse button, click and drag a color value. Works as well. And maybe here we make this maybe a tick darker, not too much. Sometimes these color adjustments you only have to do very subtle, so they nicely blend. Okay, good. Let's close this one for the moment, and there. And let's open these two. Because now I would like to show you how we can try, for example, to blend these two textures together. Because we have the cell texture and then we have the wood grain texture. And you see the problem we have is I can only plug one in. So what I have to do is the output of these two color mixers, which basically colorize the output of these two textures, I have to mix together as well. And I do this with another color mixer. So Shift D, and we can drag it in. Drag this one to there. So now color 1 and color 2 is being mixed together. And actually, this looks pretty good already. So if we take a look at it, we see a nice amount of streaks. So it looks so much more interesting. This really looks computer generated and empty. And with this, there's a lot more for your kind of like for your eyes or for your brain to see. Which again, why it is so important when we drag over the colors, we only do very subtle adjustments to it. So we try to maintain the colors for the most. Okay. Let's zoom in onto here, and also there we can see a little bit of a texture. Maybe we can go ahead and say maybe 90 to make this a little bit smaller. Okay, good. Let's zoom out more. There. And there are now two further variations we can do. Currently, this Voronoi texture I actually use to give that rather bland looking wood texture a little bit more of visual detail. But I actually specifically on the end grain would like my pores to actually pop out more. So let me show you now how we can take this and further develop it. So this actually relief, this is all pretty good. I would like to introduce you in the moment to another node. And we can go to add, and then it is under converter and called color ramp. And a color ramp looks like a gradient, black and white. We can, for example, actually move these markers around. So you see this is marker 1 at a position 0.6. This is actually 1, so 100% or 0%. 50% would be the middle. If we click this one, you see now we have black selected, white selected. We can press the plus and plus to add more elements. You see first, second, third, and fourth marker. And we can also remove markers this way. We can switch between different color modes. We can define, for example, how this should blend. Here, let me put this to there, and if I go to linear, you can see how this adjusts. So there are different ways to do the blending. Okay, and when I bring this over to here, and for example, click on this white, we can adjust the color, and I can make this, for example, transparent. So, why is this actually important or useful? So I will put this one into the factor. Let's bring this one back, and then I will feed the color output into the diffuse, and you will see this. Okay, so it looks exactly like this. There's no change. But the trick is now that with the color ramp, I can actually compress or clamp kind of like what is black and what is white. So this is black and this is white. And here in the center is basically mid-gray. And when I move this slider, let's say to the center, then I say what is mid-gray is now white. And basically I blend between black and white at a much shorter distance on my texture. So you see when I zoom in, you see now there are a lot of gray values are simply missing because it goes much quicker from basically black to white. Or I can go the opposite this way. Okay, So you see, with this function, I can make a lot of the gray surrounding area white, and I see actually much better the pores on the end grain and at the side. And the trick is now the alpha value, which is defining the transparency. You see that the color ramp has a color and an alpha output. So let's put this one back into there, and let's drag the color into the factor. Or we can, for example, drag the alpha into the factor. And you see, it looks a little bit different. So there, now I mix all the textures from the wave and the Voronoi after they're being colorized 50-50 together, including all the nice details from the Voronoi. But if I bring this one over, I can drag this one maybe out. So let's make this one maybe white. There, now you can see it. Now you can see, for example, how much from the Voronoi texture I only bring over. Now this is a little bit more 100%, and here I only bring certain elements over. A different way to think about what's happening here right now. So let's say you take a piece of cardboard and then you cut a logo out, and then you take the cardboard, works like a stencil, put it against the wall, and use a spray can and you spray over the opening. Where you have the opening, paint goes through, and where you have the cardboard, the paint doesn't go through onto the wall. And essentially the color ramp with the transparency value with alpha does exactly the same. So where we have, for example, the black, it doesn't really matter that's black, but it's opaque. So nothing can pass, and where it's transparent, stuff can pass. So, and then this transparency image basically defines where can I see the original black of my mixer and where can I see the color from my cell structure being mixed into it. So let's bring this one back. So then there you see now, for example, the cells a little bit better, and you see all these lines. Okay, but as I mentioned before, I really like the look of this, and I just want, in addition, to have, for example, the cells being a little bit more pronounced. So what I will do in addition now is I will move this one a little bit to there, and to this result I will add now just the pure pores. So we can Shift A, then color mixer, drag one more in, and then, for example, maybe this we can mix in. So this now basically looks nearly the same, and then we do an alpha. Okay, so there we see now this actually added a little bit more of the pores to it, and this looks quite nice. As comparison, without it and with it. Okay, so let's see what we can do with the black. Let's make the black actually transparent, and you see it's also gone. So now I have a little bit of creative ability to say, well, how much of the pores do I even want to see? Do I want to have a nice saturated overlay, or just only a little bit of extra color added to where the pores are? So we can do now a quick comparison without and with it. Okay. So that doesn't look actually too bad. Now the trick is really trying to find the correct color values for your grain, for the pores, etc., and also scale wise, so that the wood texture we are creating here looks somewhat believable to the type of wood you try to imitate. So let's clean maybe this up a little bit. We can rearrange them. So for example, this color mixer on there, maybe this one can be important. So maybe we leave it there, the color ramp. And the nice thing about this is, again, because everything is procedurally driven, we can go ahead and say, well, maybe I want here the pores at the side look different. So you see, with adjusting this value, I adjusted the look of the texture, which is then being colorized and added to the wave texture. And at the same time, this also adjusts the size for the color ramp texture, which then later we kind of like glue over the whole material as just an emphasis as the pores. So you're kind of dealing with multiple textures, but you see just one adjustment, for example here in scale, adjust all the other textures. This is a little bit different than maybe one would work with traditional material systems where you do not have nodes, but you see that while there is obviously a certain learning curve at the beginning, afterwards, once you understand the concept, this is a very powerful and creative tool to utilize. There is obviously still a huge difference of a procedural wood to, for example, how a natural looks like. Now, there are ways to make a procedural wood material look really very believable, but this actually requires a lot more sophisticated understanding of how to create such a material. Since this is a beginning exercise, I will leave the wood material for the texture at this level. But you see, with just a little bit of finesse and some right colors and a little bit of adjustment for the mapping and scaling, for example, for the wood grain and the pores, we can already achieve a somewhat believable visual representation of a material. And for our first rendering exercise, this also will be perfectly sufficient. So the last thing I would I would like to show you is now, because this material uses the object orientation, so basically its own local orientation. When we, for example, rotate this object, you will see that the wood texture perfectly rotates with it. And you can even see the way how we cut this cube with the other cube. We always get perfectly matching and very believable views of the wood texture where we cut into the piece of lumber. And that is basically the main reason why when we create furniture where we do not work with veneers, which are 2D, so for 2D stuff, then we can easily just work with a two-dimensional wood material. But when we work with lumber that has a volume and it's even cut, then you can see using this type of three-dimensional material is just totally superior. There's a little bit of work to set up the material, but later we can just move these cutting elements around and the software does all the updating and calculations of the correct material at the cut faces for us automatically.